Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
This week, the 2021 session is underway, and both chambers have made safety concessions. A key lawmaker describes a new task force report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we meet another newly elected senator. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. The Senate and the House of Representatives convened the 92nd legislative session in historic fashion this week due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The safety concessions made by the respective chambers in the inaugural meeting are indicative of how the session will likely continue. House members took the oath of office almost exclusively in a remote format, while the Senate administered the oath with a majority of lawmakers in person. Small groups of senators turned in their election certificates one by one and then took the oath of office as they socially distanced themselves throughout the chamber. Supreme Court Justice G. Barry Anderson also administered the oath virtually to those senators who preferred to remain away from the state capitol. The first debate of the new session focused on the election of a Senate President pro tem instead of a Senate President.
It's interesting times that we're in, and just to lay all the cards out on the table, a number of years ago there was a federal senator in Minnesota that resigned, and the prior governor picked his lieutenant governor to fulfill that spot. That was now Senator Tina Smith. By Constitution, it left an opening that the President of the Senate then had to become Lieutenant Governor, and it created a whole series of events when we were at that time 34-33, Republicans 34, Democrats 33, and suddenly we had this discrepancy about what direction we should go. We believed that that position could hold the lieutenant governor position and still be a senator, and there was court battles. In the end, there was also a special election. It cost both sides a lot of money, and it made it very difficult for us to govern in the Senate when we were 33-33 and wondering how it was going to turn out. And so we made a decision, the Republicans in the Senate, to elect Senator Tomassoni as president in November and in December special sessions, so that if Senator Amy Klobuchar ended up being part of President-elect Biden's cabinet, and if Senator Walz decided to then pick Lieutenant Governor Flanagan to become the federal senator, that we would not have another scenario where our narrow majority was jeopardized. And so the last remaining president, or last elected president, is Senator Tomassoni. So we worked with our nonpartisan staff, and they said that we can, for a period of time, appoint acting president of Senator Miller and Senator Pro Tem to be Senator Tomassoni, and the two will work together for a while we wait to see what President-elect Biden does.
Why this method? We've never had an acting president in my 30-plus years we've been here. Why not just elect Senator Tomassoni as your president? You could always elect someone else later. Why go through these shenanigans, these measures that are just not common usage in the Senate?
It has to do with what I laid out as a path. I think Senator Tomassoni has done a reasonable job. Senator Miller certainly wants to remain the president. Our caucus supports him as president, and so we're trying to find a place in between that fulfilled our obligations to the Constitution, but also acknowledge that Senator Miller has done a great job, and we want him to remain president long term.
There seems to be a pattern in your party to kind of not following the rules, to inventing rules as we move along that are convenient to you, and I think it would be much preferable if we just followed our standard procedure that we have presidents for, and that is to elect a president.
We don't know that that scenario I laid out will happen, but in my time period, it has happened within the last 4 years, and it was very difficult to manage the Senate under that scenario. And so we're just simply trying to avoid that scenario. I don't think it will last long, but that's the reason why.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. No. The motion prevails and the resolution is adopted.
The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force report was presented to the Legislature in December. The report notes that while American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of Minnesota's population, they represent 8% of all murdered women and girls. This week, I spoke with Senator Mary Kunesh, co-chair of the task force, about the group's findings and recommendations.
This report is the first attempt to get at the root causes of the disproportionately high rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. First, who are Two-Spirit people? And second, what are some of the causes?
So our Two-Spirit folks are members of our communities who do not identify exclusively as a man or a woman, but who basically embody a distinct, almost alternative third gender status that is non-binary and bi-gender. And it's important to know that historically in many tribes, Two-Spirit people filled some of the most respected, revered roles such as healers and shamans and ceremonial leaders. And then to respond to root causes, well, the root causes of the MMIW injustices are really based as far back as basic colonization and the historic trauma, racism and sexism, as well as sexual objectification. I always have a hard word with that. Objectification of our Indigenous women and girls, and the disruptions that are caused by the conquest and disease, along with missionary settlement, government agents, boarding schools, white settlers settling on lands that were identified as reservations. So those are the sort of things, along with confusing jurisdiction, that has really been at the root of the problem of the violence against our women and Two-Spirits.
Now, you mentioned jurisdictional confusion, and I want to talk about that because the report does point to that lack of understanding between tribal, county, and state agencies in terms of investigations and prosecutions. Many fall through the cracks. What is a solution to improve communication among those law enforcement entities?
Well, I'm really heartened by a lot of the recent state-led efforts to recognize and build those relationships with our 11 tribes, as well as the increasing and understanding about the MMIW injustices. And I'm really optimistic that these actions will contribute to a longer-term solution in Indian country, not just in Minnesota, but across the nation. So, for example, legislation I passed with bipartisan support where we modified tribal police to exercise concurrent state law enforcement jurisdiction authority. And that sets a huge precedence for tribal self-governing. And then more collaboration across the board with a lot of the programming that works with the violence against our Native communities is really on the uptick, and we're very grateful for that kind of open communication.
One of the recommendations is for sex trafficking awareness prevention efforts, particularly near casinos and where extractive industries in oil and mining occur. I recall a great deal of discussion about sex trafficking when the Super Bowl came to town, but this suggests that sex trafficking is an ongoing problem, perhaps particularly in these areas. Is that true?
It is. And people will always ask for that data and facts around that. And unfortunately, data has not always been and rarely has been collected. But anecdotally, and then in some studies, even the University of Minnesota did a study before the Super Bowl, recognizes that sex traffickers prey on the vulnerable and the voiceless. And that certainly describes the historical status of Native American women. But that report that I referred to that the University of Minnesota did in 2017 found that all different events feed sex trafficking: trade shows, holiday weekends, hunting, sporting events, and that generates an increase in sex trafficking. But the potential harm for man camps that are created by the extraction industry is really exacerbated when those locations and the projects are near Native communities, because there is data that shows an uptick in the communities where these extraction industries are with man camps, because it's ripe for the exploitation of the vulnerable community members, but especially our Native women and children.
There was one key finding that struck me as being very important, and I will quote it. Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are not at increased risk of violence because of individual risky behavior or poor choices, but rather because of systemic risk factors like poverty, homelessness, child welfare involvement, domestic violence, sex trafficking, and prostitution place them in dangerous situations. Can you say more about this?
Sure. Well, you know, too often the victim is re-victimized by being blamed for being the victim, and that they let themselves be used and abused. But we know that those factors that you mentioned just a minute ago put most of our Indigenous women and girls at higher risk of violence and exploitation. They go missing at higher rates or are murdered. You know, in Minnesota, our American Indians are more likely than any other group to live in poverty. So not having a safe place to stay puts our Indigenous people at risk of exploitation and violence. The historic withholding of material and emotional needs for our Indigenous communities has also contributed. The child welfare system is also unfortunately contributed to the MMI injustices in a couple of ways. And, you know, first of all, it disrupts our Indigenous family structure and functioning, removes the children from their culture, their traditions, and that really does result in intergenerational trauma. And then secondly, the disproportionately removal of our Indigenous children from their families and placed in foster care, out-of-home care, puts them at an increased risk of abuse and exploitation. And so some of the federal laws and state laws really are important that we are implementing all of these with fidelity in order to ensure that our Native communities don't feel the historic distrust and are vulnerable to our predators that cause all this issue.
If the legislature acts, then a missing and murdered Indigenous women office would be created, and possibly there would be a dashboard annually to track progress. What would this new office be charged with doing?
Well, basically, this new office will support tribes and the issues that surround them. With that tribal consultation that has improved over the last couple of years, we'll be able to support different activities and protocols, such as holding the Minnesota Legislature and our state agencies accountable for implementing some of the mandates in this report. And then hopefully we would like to develop additional recommendations to address that MMIW injustice. It'll develop tools and processes to evaluate some of the implementations, technical assistance for local and tribal and law enforcement and agencies, so that we can share the data and share the information that comes across it. And then kind of do annual reports on things that are changing, things that need to be changed. It's just really important that we are working together on this issue, because if we can combat sex trafficking or this violence against women in Indian country, then we absolutely can expand that to the general community as well as other vulnerable groups of people.
Senator Mary Kunesh, I want to thank you for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
In the first hearing of the Senate Education Committee of the 2021 session, members met remotely for an informational meeting on getting kids back into schools.
We have 12 testifiers, 10 of them are parents, various places in the state, various capacities, and to talk about the school closings and how they're doing. And
it really bothers me that the people who speak the loudest about caring about the most marginalized in society are the ones yelling the loudest about keeping distance learning going, even though it's not working for most people. So just please remember that education is the great equalizer, like it was for me, from my personal experience. And I'm asking that you guys do something to allow the money to follow the kids, like it was for my kid, Caleb. Even though that program is just for kids with disabilities and it's not required for kids, I think something like that should be enacted for more students. And that in general, if parents want to choose private school or any other option like tutoring right now, that needs to happen immediately, because the kids who are the most marginalized are falling further and further behind.
My daughter Ella is in 4th grade. She misses her teachers and her classmates, but more than that. And she loves her teacher, but each day, seems much more like an exercise in checking off the boxes than it does really like a true learning experience. Joshua is my 8th grader. He spends each day shifting between technology platforms like Schoology, Notability, Google Meets, and others, which make up a complicated web of tools for viewing videos, downloading assignments, attending meets, and submitting his work. He struggles to keep up with deadlines and inevitably the details that get lost in the shuffle of all of that. Like many others, his grades have fallen. But it's Evan, my 6th grader, who we really worry about the most. He's our child diagnosed with ADHD. He's got an IEP for academic and emotional social development support. In distance learning, he's just detached from school. He needs interaction with teachers, and absent that, he just doesn't connect with the coursework.
Hill Murray, the private school near us, has had more in-person education than our students in White Bear Lake will have all year long. There's a huge gap between the people that are available to afford a private school to the ones that are in public school, in my opinion. It's heartbreaking to watch as a parent. I've seen firsthand kids in our neighborhood at 11 years old now cutting themselves, and the stress of those parents. Through all of this, I would say in closure, what the shutdowns have meant to our family has been a roller coaster of sacrifice, of depression, excitement, tons of family bonding, happiness to letdowns and confusion, disappointment, isolation, and a huge financial sacrifice to our family that no COVID relief plan will ever touch.
Families in need of internet and technology, only to be left in the cold without any access to a chance at a quality life, because that's exactly what a quality education leads us to. Schools across the state of Minnesota holding families accountable for absences when it was really the Zoom or the Google Meet and a lack of an understanding on how to use those tools that kept our children from being in class.
The 2020 election resulted in the Senate gaining 10 new members. This week, I spoke with Senator Lindsey Port about her path to elected office and the issues she's advocating for.
You beat incumbent Dan Hall by 6 percentage points in the November election to represent District 56, which includes most of Burnsville, part of Lakeville and Savage. Senator Hall represented the district for 10 years. Why do you think the voters chose you this time?
Well, I think a few things went into voters choosing me, choosing all Democrats and all women to represent the district. First, I've been organizing in the district for nearly a decade now, on issue campaigns, for candidates, for local issues, and with sort of a wide variety of partner groups led by the people of the district. And at the heart of all of that organizing has been really the idea that our leaders and our policies should more closely reflect the people and the needs of our district. And also that the people of our district should be included in that conversation and in the decision making. And that was something that really just wasn't happening before. Our district was hungry for accountability and transparency and really a meaningful relationship with our leaders. It's something I've worked really hard on over the last decade and something that I'm certain my community will hold me accountable for. And then secondly, I think our district has just changed a lot over the last decade. We're more diverse. We have a lot of young families. We have seniors who are worried about being able to stay in the communities that they helped build as they age. And sort of the common thread through all of those diverse groups in our community is that the status quo just isn't working for them. And it hasn't been working for a while. So I think it's a combination of our district needing and being ready for change and choosing and building leaders that are accountable and are in relationship with the people of the district.
Now, I remember first hearing your name back a few years ago when the Me Too movement came to the Minnesota State Capitol due to unwelcome sexual behavior by lawmakers. You spoke out, and that speaking out affected your candidacy for the House at the time, and I read that it also impacted your business. How do you view that experience now, and do you think the situation has improved for women in politics?
Well, I'll start by saying that I'm still glad that I spoke out, and I don't regret that choice, even though it had a big cost. I know that progress doesn't come easy or for free, and that means we have to do the right thing, even when it's hard. We are on a path to see real change, real progress for women, but we still have a long way to go. We do have the most women ever elected to the Minnesota Legislature this year, and that's fantastic. We are about to have a Black woman sworn in as the Vice President of the United States, which is a huge step. And I believe that representation matters. The more women that we have in elected office, the more likely we are to see progress on women's issues. But we aren't moving fast enough. Women of color have suffered disproportionately during this pandemic, and they were already making the least and had the worst health outcomes before. So as we talk about doing the work to bring this pandemic to a close and to begin working towards recovery, I'm really committed to ensuring that we're centering women in that work, because lifting up women lifts up our entire communities. Women have disproportionately left the workforce, and that hurts our economy. Women have disproportionately borne the burden of distance learning and caring for our families. And we need to have our recovery reflect that, especially for women of color. I'm really proud to have a loud voice for women's issues, and I'm honored to continue my work in that regard in the Senate.
So my next question leads to this, because this is basically your wheelhouse. You founded a nonprofit organization that seeks to engage young women, young people, women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ+ community in the political process. So you are practicing what you preach. Is that your main goal in running for the Senate then?
Yeah, much like my work at Blueprint Campaigns, my run for the Senate really was centered on the idea that representation matters. It matters that we have the most women ever in the Minnesota Legislature, but we're still not at 50% of elected officials. It matters that our elected officials more closely reflect the communities that we work for. But it's equally important, I think, that as elected officials, we work in partnership with our communities to ensure that we're bringing their voices to the table. For me, it was a combination of fighting for a more representative government, but also for more accountable leaders who will co-govern with our communities.
Education appears to be an important focus for you, and you do have 2 school-age children. You mention disparities in the educational system on your campaign website, and you say that Minnesota's opportunity gaps are, quote, reinforced by decades of failed education policy. How can Minnesota fix this problem?
Yeah, we need to be willing to make real, large-scale investments in education. The pandemic has shown that the needs of children are really varied, and we needed to be flexible and change rapidly. Our teachers have done really incredible work over the last year, but in talking with them, having conversations with them, they are drowning. They do not have the resources that they need, and they know that students are falling behind. And we can't just pretend that as we're beginning the process of moving out of this pandemic, that we can just go back to normal. Like you said, Minnesota has some of the worst in the nation scores for racial disparities in education, and we have to address those. Your zip code or your neighborhood shouldn't affect your ability to get a world-class education here in Minnesota. We should be fully funding education at the state level so that we aren't relying on communities to continually raise property taxes, which just widens disparities, just to sort of stay at the status quo and tread water. We can think bigger and better, and our educators and our students should be at the forefront of that discussion.
You wrote on your website that families are significantly different than 50 years ago, and that as gender equality increases in the workplace, paid family and medical leave are good for families. Both you and your husband run small businesses, and often the criticism towards paid family medical leave and these kinds of benefits is that it is too expensive for small business. What's your perspective on that? Because you do have a real world position, experience on that.
Yeah, it's often sort of stated that these are something that small businesses can't afford, but there's something that small businesses can't afford to do without. As small business owners, we're already competing with large corporations for employees, and we can't provide that same level of benefits because we can't negotiate as a large group, and the bottom line is prohibitive. People aren't starting new businesses because the cost of healthcare or paid family leave for their own family, let alone the cost for employees, is prohibitive. That stifles innovation, it hurts communities, and it's a drag on our economy. And small businesses cannot do it alone. It's not working. Small businesses and any individual should be able to buy into Minnesota Care. We could do it tomorrow if we wanted to. It would be a tremendous relief for the cost of benefits for small businesses, and it would be a huge lift for employees and families that need access to affordable health insurance. But really, as we saw during the pandemic, that because there's not a paid family medical leave program, women left the workforce to care for their families. That's a huge drag on our economy. We should immediately begin work on moving forward with a paid family medical leave program. They work roughly like an unemployment insurance program, where employers or businesses pay a small amount in so that when employees need the leave, the cost is paid by the program and not solely the business owner. It's working in other states, and we have great models to build off. Washington, the state of Washington has been particularly successful, and their model is really similar to the model that has been proposed and will be proposed again this year here in Minnesota. I think small businesses and families are hurting because we don't have these programs that can help them provide these needed benefits. We can fix that. Just thinking about it, just imagine how much more innovative and productive our small and local businesses could be if they didn't spend a quarter of their work week as healthcare administrators. It's far past time to put these programs that work all over the world in place for our businesses and our families.
Senator Lindsey Port, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.